Baby farming, a Victorian horror story. Baby farming came way before the wayward children of society were protected by the state through adoption. First came baby farming, then the orphanages, before formal adoptions. Baby farming really was as shudder-inducing as it sounds, and the horror of those caught in the system was profound. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Many parents found themselves too penniless to care for their children, and due to a lack of contraception, babies were born to families that were too poor to feed another life, and so these children were taken into custody for a small fee. This small fee made these dark parts of society a profit-making organisation. It was the most prevalent during the late Victorian era in England, but the practice was seen much further away in North America also. The number of abortions performed was high, despite it being unlawful. It was often the cheapest option for a working-class Victorian family, but it did bring many risks, such as infection and death to the mother. This is why the popularity of another alternative to abortion increased, because it was less dangerous for a woman, but it did come at a price. The families or single women would surrender their newborn to a baby farm for a weekly fee, and that the children would receive amazing care. They imagined one-on-one wet nurses, 24-hour attention, their own room and food, but this was sadly not the case, as it was common knowledge that wealthy women also placed their children with wet nurses who would look after the babies and even breastfeed them in the absence of their biological mothers. It was assumed that the working-class women's children would have the same great experience. In 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act was introduced, and the aim was to allow poor and unwed mothers to be given food, money or clothing from the parish, but these privileges were in return for their time working in the workhouse. The workhouses were in grim conditions, and therefore many women refused to work there, instead opting to work elsewhere. One of the best paid professions at the time was in domestic service as servants for the wealthy, but this involved living in the wealthy person's home. This job was not suitable for a woman that had children, but because the pay was good, women with children would still do the role, but would then send their money back to the other women that were paid to raise their infants. This was the community's answer to working mothers during the Victorian era. The theory behind these systems would work well. The children would gain access to 24-hour care while the mother was able to work, and the babies would be kept not far from their mother's work. The reality, however, was very different to what mothers assumed their children would be subjected to. Due to the neglect at these farms, the children would struggle to make it past infancy. And due to the profit-making nature of the business, it allowed people to become greedy. The women and nurses took on more and more children, and the ratios became unsafe as the money rolled in. The women could no longer realistically care for all of these babies in the way the working mothers had envisioned. As is often the case nowadays, profit came first. Take more children in and cut the cost of essentials to care for them. This would result in more money. The Victorians were feeling the squeeze, and during the peak of the industrialisation and urbanisation, alongside frozen wages, the baby farms would advertise, seeking for more unwanted children that they could foster or adopt. Baby farms were located in city centres where the demand for them was higher. They allowed their parents to work, but they were notoriously unhealthy and unsafe places for children. The children sent there would die quickly from illness, malnutrition, neglect, and abuse. Even those that worked there that had good intentions to care for these children often fell short, and the chance of surviving to adulthood was poor. As soon as mothers could leave their bed after birth, the babies were shipped off to these farms, where the breast milk they had grown accustomed to stopped, and instead they were given non-nutritious substitutes. Those that paid weekly had a better chance of their child surviving, as there was an incentive to keep that child alive. However, those that paid up front for their place were neglected more. If the child died quickly, then they had already gained their fee and could go to the next family for their fee too, leaving room to house more vulnerable children and bringing in a constant supply of cash. It was the desperation of these families that led them to continue to leave their children in these dire situations, despite the dangers being obvious. This practice eventually led to one of the darkest pages in recent history. One of the most prolific serial killers in the world was a baby farmer, Amelia Dyer. She was a widow and a trained nurse, and initially she cared for the children legitimately, but over years in her profession, her motive became fueled by money, and the killing of innocent children allowed her to live comfortably. It's estimated that she took 400 lives in her baby farming business. She strangled many of them and disposed of the bodies. One of the babies was discovered in the River Thames. Amelia was born in 1837 to a shoemaker in a small village in Bristol. Dyer had suffered a hard upbringing, and one that potentially shaped the evil woman that she became. Her nursing profession was formed out of her experience caring for her mentally ill mother, of whom she was the main caregiver for. Her skills of caring for people started off as a passion, but slowly became the opposite when she embarked on a disturbing, murderous trail of the most innocent in society. The demand for baby farms was high. The mothers had little options and were often forced into dangerous situations, such as prostitution or starvation. Baby farmers, including Amelia, would offer to take the children off their hands and offer it an alternative future, but this did not promise a happy future, or even a future at all. Dyer advertised her services in newspapers, describing herself as highly respectable. Her advert stated, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £10. Her home provided anything but a safe and loving home, and once the fee had been given by the mother, she would murder them. Her methods differed and alternated between starving them, drugging them with an opiate-laced cordial known as Mother's Friend, or by strangling them. The term fostering or adopting at the time became a term that was used to describe the practice of slowly or quickly killing children, and the practice led to thousands of babies and children suffering or dying at the hands of those that were supposed to care for them. The high infant mortality rates meant that she was able to mask the murder that she was committing, instead blaming the poor and grim reality of living throughout the Victorian era, and the authorities were none the wiser. Dyer travelled all over England to collect children, whom she charged a fee up front to care for them. Prices range from £10 to £80, which is equivalent to about £1,000 to £8,000 today for her services. The mothers were desperate to work to provide for themselves and their families. They thought they would be well cared for, but instead, their babies were murdered over a number of days or hours. Eventually, the truth caught up with her in 1879, when doctors became suspicious over the number of deaths she had certified in her care, and a package was found in the Thames with the remains of Helena Fry, a child who had been tied to a brick and left in the river. For her crimes, she was sentenced to 6 months' hard labour for neglect. Upon her release, her remorse did not surface. She continued her grisly business, just with a different modus operandi. Rather than register the deaths in her care, she decided to dispose of the bodies herself, so not to highlight her crimes again. She would throw the children into the River Thames, and this would bring her eventual downfall. When Helena Fry's body was fished from the water, a clue was spotted. The packaging bore a Midland Railway stamp dated the 24th of October 1895 and was marked Bristol Temple Meads. The name and address was also visible despite being smudged, and it was a Mrs. Thomas of 26 Pigott's Road, Caversham. This was Dyer's married name and former address. When the police arrived in her town to search for the murderer, the neighbours reported that she had left. The police found piles of baby clothing and numerous receipts from advertisements in various newspapers from across the country. They also found the tape that was used to strangle the child, and 4 days later Dyer was found and charged with killing a child. On the 22nd of May 1896, she appeared at the Old Bailey for trial. She had attempted to scupper the jury with a plea of insanity, but the prosecutors were able to prove that her mental instability was merely a ploy to avoid repercussions for her crimes. At her most active, neighbours and witnesses reported seeing as many as 6 babies a day being taken into her home, and Dyer was operating this system over a period of 30 years, meaning the true scale of her murderous spree is likely to have included hundreds of children. Dyer confessed to the crime shortly before she was hanged. The trial highlighted the devastating truth behind desperate women and families who were giving up their babies, and it took this depraved story for the law to be pursued more effectively and rigorously at a national and local level. And that is when the newly established NSPCC became more influential. Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison on Wednesday the 10th of June 1896, having eventually confessed to her crimes. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.